right, thanks, Abby. Great to see everybody today. Those who are tuning in online, we welcome you as well. We've been in a series called Out of Egypt, and what we've looked at is from Matthew's gospel, we've seen that Jesus is compared to Moses. And so we see Jesus and Moses as two leaders who bring hope and salvation and deliverance and freedom and liberation. And they're contrasted with each other, and Jesus is seen in Matthew's gospel particularly as a new Moses leading in the ways of Moses for all people. And so we're looking at all these parallels right now between Jesus and Moses. Now, we've been going through the story of Exodus because there's a lot of parallels with Exodus and then Jesus' leadership as well. I just watched for the first time The Prince of Egypt. It's a movie that came out 25 years ago with DreamWorks and had some Steven Spielberg money in the DreamWorks behind it. And it was a wonderful. How many of you have seen Prince of Egypt? See? All right. Since I didn't have young kids, I missed a lot of the cartoons that came out, over the last few years. But every now and then I go back and try to catch them. It's an excellent vision of what took place in the Exodus, I think, and there's some creative license there. I loved what they did with Moses and Ramses, as Moses growing up in the courts of Pharaoh, but then becoming aware of his Hebrew heritage and how his people were enslaved, even though he was growing up in the riches and the wealth of Pharaoh's courts, and ultimately being the one that God calls back to Egypt, back to lead his people out of slavery. And Prince of Egypt plays up on the relationship between Moses and the Pharaoh, growing up in the courts together, being friends together, and then all of a sudden Moses going to his friend who was his brother, who's now Pharaoh, and then saying, "Let my people go." You know that Moses had to have some connection with the Pharaoh, right? We're not sure exactly from the biblical story how deep that connection was, but he grew up in Pharaoh's court. And it could have been easily one of the sons of Pharaoh when Moses was born that Moses grew up with who became the Pharaoh. So it's an interesting interpretation of this classic passage. Let's remember that the Hebrew people, after Joseph, were enslaved by the Egyptians largely to do the works projects that were going on, from perhaps the pyramids to all the other building work projects that went on in Egypt, one of the most prosperous countries in the ancient world. And Hebrew people were used as slaves with no freedom, absolute, what we would call chattel slavery. They would have been seen as people who were owned by their slave holders. They had no rights, they had no freedoms, they had no vacations, they had no Sabbath, they had no time off. It was work 7 days a week. It would have been child labor work. It would have been work for the elderly. There would have been literally a dehumanization of the Hebrew people. Easily when people work as slaves, they begin to be viewed as less than human. And this is the perspective that would have been taking shape in Egypt with the Hebrew people. Let's remember that this is an African slave rebellion. Isn't that wild to think about as we look in Egypt? You forget that Egypt's a part of Africa sometimes, right? And that over 400 years, the Hebrew people had been enslaved, and now this group of slaves is going to rebel against their overlords and actually gain their victory. And so it's an amazing story. Let's remember that the 10 plagues that happened to Egypt and Pharaoh are very much a part of the creation story and then the decreation story. So if you go back to Genesis 1, where it opens up with creation, you have that picture of the Spirit hovering over the waters. And then God says, "Let there be light." And then all of the separation and the filling goes on with everything popping into creation, including human beings who are seen as being in the image of God. And if you think about the image of God in the ancient Near East, guess what that term was? It was an elitist term. Only the kings or the pharaohs or the monarchs were considered to be in the image of God. It was an elite term only for the ruler, the dictator, the monarch, the king. This is the first time in ancient history that we can see that that term, in the image of God, was democratized and used as for all people. And not just men, but for women. Every single person, man and woman, male and female, are made in the image of God. So no longer is that an elitist term for only the king or the dictator or the monarch or the pharaoh, because the pharaoh would have saw himself as the manifest presence of God in the image of God over Egypt. Now in this Hebrew book, we see that every person is a king and a queen. Every person is in the image of God. This means that there are no lesser persons. Every single person has the full dignity of humanity in the image of God with full equality, full dignity before God, and that should be how it lives out in the rest of the world, right? But that's not how it has gone, has it? Have you noticed in world history that there's people who like to have all power and all money and all influence, and then they love to suppress people so that they can have more power and more money and more influence? Has anybody noticed that pattern in world history, right? And so that's kind of the story that we're looking at right now. We're looking at the story of oppressors who want to oppress so they can gain power, and strip the dignity out of certain individuals so they can have more power and influence. So this is the story. So in the plagues, when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, let my people go, let's remember that this is a God who hears the cries of the oppressed, of the outcast, of the marginalized, those whose rights and dignity have been stripped away and reduced to slave chattel. This is a God who hears the cries of those people. And in hearing the cries of those people, God then begins to call people to do something about it. So God calls Moses, who's uniquely placed, right? He's given up in order to save his life as a child found by one of Pharaoh's daughters, raised in Pharaoh's court, but he's a Hebrew. And as he grows up, we don't know how often he connected with his Hebrew heritage. It's quite possible that he grew up in Pharaoh's court and early on didn't even realize that he was the son of a Hebrew, right? But at some point, he began to be aware and then began to take notice and then began to see the mistreatment of his own people and ultimately murdered one of those people who was mistreating one of his people out of anger, fled because he didn't want to lose his own life, and then through the burning bush, God calls him back. And he goes back to probably the Pharaoh that he might have grown up with. It could have been a brother that he grew up with, right, in Pharaoh's court. And now all of a sudden he's saying, hey, buddy, hey, Ramses, let my people go. The one God who hears the voice of the oppressed is the God who's saying to you, let my people go. And let's remember, Pharaoh in Egypt, they had lots of gods for everything. And in every one of the 10 plagues, there's actually an Egyptian god connected to that. And so a part of the story here is that the one true God who hears the cries of the oppressed is doing battle against the many gods who empower the oppressors. So the story here is kind of an interesting one. It's like satire. It's like the monotheistic God who hears every cry, who values every human person, who sees every person in the dignity and image of God. That God is hearing the cry of the poor and the oppressed. But all of these other gods, they're the gods that empower the oppressor. So you see the battle is between the oppressing forces of systemic evil, systemic oppression, systemic slavery, those gods are in battle against the voice of the God of love who's calling freedom for all people and raising up the dignity of all people. So in the creation story, it starts with the Spirit hovering, and then let there be light, and then it flourishes, and then humans are made in the image of God, all humans equally in the image of God, and then there's rest and Sabbath. You don't have to work all the time. There's dignity, there's play, there's worship. Life is not just all about work, but it's about family and joy and love and freedom and creativity and goodness. And work can be beautiful, and work can be edifying and dignifying, but there are some kinds of work that dehumanize and oppress and marginalize and create outcasts. So this is a story of liberation, of freedom, of deliverance, of hope. The first 9 plagues are kind of seen first as irritants, and then they affect the Pharaoh economically, and then they affect their bodies and their personhood, and then ultimately it ends in death. So if you look at the first plague, the water turns to blood. In the creation story, the Spirit hovers over the water. In the creation story, let there be light. But in the plagues, we see a reversal of creation. Water turns to blood. Frogs come out of the water. They die. They begin to infest. And then mosquitoes, and then flies, and then even the livestock becomes infested, and then boils, and then hail, and then locusts, and then ultimately the 9th plague is darkness. So waters to darkness. And in the creation story, it's life, 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 life. In the plague story, it's waters, blood, pestilence, hail, all of this stuff, and then it ends in darkness, not light. And then the 10th plague is what? Death itself. What happens in the creation story? You see no death, right? It's life, 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 life. But in the plague story, it's the reverse, and it ends in death, the death angel. So this is the story. We're talking about sin and death. What is the word sin? It's actually just hurting other people. If you want to boil it down, it's like hurting people. It's creating harm for creation and for other people. When we do things that hurt, violate, oppress other people, that's really what sin is all about. It's about a broken relationship. When you get hurt in a relationship, there's probably some hurt that's gone on, right? And so when we harm and hurt others, that's really the term for sin. And then death can be not just physical death, but there's spiritual death, right? We can be walking around and talking, but we can be walking in oppression. We can be walking in dehumanizing way. We can hurt ourselves. We can hurt other people. We can hurt the heart of God. We can hurt one another. We can hurt family members. And so there's a spiritual death as well as a physical death. And so I think as we look at this story, we realize that slavery and oppression and sin and death that are connected to that, and the oppressors that create sin and death, is a part of this story. Now, when we think back this distance away, slavery, we can think of it sometimes as an ancient institution. How many of you know that slavery still happens today? You aware of that? So, in the world today, we have about 195 countries. And 59 of those countries would be considered ruled by dictators. Okay? Ruled by dictators. By the way, when you analyze a dictatorial country, some countries are way worse dictatorial countries than other dictatorial countries. So there's a spectrum when it comes to the evil nature of dictatorial countries. There's different types of dictators, monarchical dictators, there's military dictators, and there's what you might call civilian dictators. Same if you go to democracy. What's interesting is that there's democracies all around the world, and there's different kinds of democracies. There's parliamentary, there's representative democracies, there's direct democracy. And on a scale of spectrum on the democracy side, you can have some democracies that are excellent at giving all their people freedom, equality, and civil rights. But then some democracies don't do as well as other democracies, and some democracies don't deliver freedoms, equal rights, and all that kind of stuff as well as others. So within dictators, there's some that are better or worse. Within even democracies, there are some better and worse. So like when America started, if you think about America, when we started, we had this vision of democracy, and all men are created equal. And particularly in the beginning days, it was what? It was all white men that were created equal, right? And so it was this incredible vision, this experiment of democracy, and yet even our founders were blinded to oppression. By the way, all of us are raised with biases. All of us have perspectives that don't liberate and can even lend toward marginalizing, othering, oppressing, or distancing, or separating ourselves from others, instead of seeing us all as God's children, created with equality and love and included. And so all of us can wrestle with these kinds of things. It took decades, sometimes hundreds of years, for the vision of democracy in America to begin to include blacks, indigenous peoples, people of color, even women. Women didn't have rights to vote till 1920. Indigenous people didn't have rights to vote till black people weren't even considered full human beings until the Civil War and the amendments that came after that. So it's been a slow progress, even in America, to create equality and opportunity for all people to liberate and to move against oppression and racism and biases and begin to minister love. This is a story about that. Let's also remember it's not just America who wrestled with slavery. Pretty much if you go back in human history, every country, the country I've gone to in Africa the most is Ethiopia. I've traveled there over the course of the last almost 3 decades, multiple times, and have great dear friends there. There's 80 tribes in Ethiopia. The 3 largest ones are the Aroma and the Amara, the Oromo, the Amara, and the Tigray. And the Amara have been in power as the tribe in power in Addis Ababa for a long time. But if you go back in the history, these tribes have fought each other for power. If they fight each other and they win, then guess what? They'll take Tigray people have enslaved Amara people, and Amara people have enslaved Tigray people. If you come into like the tribes here in America, and the indigenous peoples, I'm reading a book right now, the Navajo people would go to battle against the Apache, and then they would take slaves. The Apache would go against the Navajo, they would take Navajo slaves. It's been an awful institution for degrading human beings throughout almost all of humanity, right? This God hears the cry of those marginalized people who have been oppressed. And this God then begins to call people who hear the cry, who hear the call, to begin to move to liberate and bring freedom. Freedom from sin, freedom from spiritual death, freedom from oppression, forgiveness of sins, new life, new community that embraces all people. So we've got work cut out for us. This freedom that comes through the Passover and through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is one that liberates, forgives, but then calls us into communities who walk out love and grace and mercy for the most outcast, the most marginalized, the most oppressed. And we bring and we include and we love, and then we work for freedom and wholeness and liberation. The 10th plague, the death angel, comes into the camp one night after Moses has said, let my people go, let my people go, plague after plague after plague. Pharaoh hardens his heart, hardens his heart, hardens his heart. Finally, it comes down to death itself, right? The opposite of the creation story. It's going to end in death. And God tells the people, the Hebrew people who are oppressed, to get ready. Get ready. First of all, this death angel is going to come into the camp, and where there is not blood of the lamb on the post of the door, then the death angel will take out the firstborn, The first, and this is an imagery of the oppression and decreation that goes from water in the Nile turning to blood to darkness to very death itself. You see the imagery, the reverse of creation. And so now this death angel is going to move. And what do you have to do? Well, get ready, folks. The Hebrew people are going to take a lamb and make a meal of it, right? With the blood of the lamb, they're going to put it on the doorpost. They're going to cook the meat, roast it over the fire, and have that ready for their travel the next day. They're going to take some of the bitter herbs and greens that are part of the diet that they were given. There's a stuff called charot that looks like the mortar that they use, like an applesauce thing. And then there's going to be the unleavened bread, because you're rushing out. Pharaoh's going to finally break and let the people go because of the death angel. And the people who have the blood of the lamb on the doorpost are spared the death angel. And then in the middle of the night, basically, they got to get up and they got to flee. They're going to leave Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's going to be going, by this point, after the 10th plague, get out of here, get out of here. And Pharaoh even says, and be sure and bless me as you go. So he's like finally broken. And then finally he's like going, okay, guys, now bless me as you go. But get out of here, get out of here. So the people are fleeing in haste. And what they take with them are the lamb that's been roasted, the bitter herbs, and the unleavened bread, because they don't have time to bake it and let it grow with yeast, right? So it's all in a hurry. They're going to flee. Think about the blood of the lamb, because as we think about Jesus, one of the imageries that's picked up is that when Jesus met with his disciples the night before he was crucified, what week was it in Jerusalem? It's Passover week. Once the people of the Hebrew people fled Egypt, from that day forward, they were to remember on the 14th day of the first of the month in Nisan, they were to have the celebration of unleavened bread, a week of unleavened bread, and then have the Passover meal. In the Passover meal, they would remember the meal, the lamb, the bitter herbs, the charot, the cups of wine, and the unleavened bread. They would remember the deliverance from Egypt. And when you go through that Passover meal, you're not just thinking, hey, our forefathers were brought out of Egypt, but who was brought out of Egypt? Every generation says, we were brought out of Egypt. God brought us out of Egypt, our children, and the next generation, the next generation. This is a freedom that's proclaimed for all generations. And so Jesus, in that meal with the disciples the night before he's crucified, most likely a Passover meal, right? Takes the cup and the bread, identifies his calling, his ministry with that Passover meal, and is said in his own death, which, by the way, Jesus' death was what? Brought about by the oppression of the emperor of Rome, equivalent to Pharaoh, right? Who were pressing the Hebrew people again in the Roman Empire. They were basically had limited freedoms under the Roman Empire. And Jesus is going to bring forth this meal as a symbol for everybody to participate in. Through the teaching, the life, the death of Jesus, he's going to be crushed. His blood's going to be shed by the power of empire. But that's not the end of the story. Through his love and nonviolent resistance, there's going to be a resurrection. There's going to be a God who hears the cry. There's going to be a God who hears that there's a way to bring forth freedom and liberation through people. And so Jesus is going to call his people into community to walk against the empire, to resist nonviolently with love the empire, and to walk out a set of values, the Beatitudes, that are really shaped for those who are under oppression. If you read the Beatitudes, it's a series of values for people who are under oppression. And it's a series of values that liberate the oppressed and the marginalized and the broken. We can be crushed by systems, but we can be also crushed by our own hurtfulness, and we can be crushed by other people's hurtfulness. So this story is one of freedom, forgiveness, liberation, love, radical inclusion of all people. There's nobody better than anybody else. And it's about creating communities that work in love and liberation, that work against death and sin, hurt and harm, and ultimately propagate love and freedom and equality in the image of God for all people. So Jesus is going to pick up on those themes of the Passover and literally apply it to his own life, death, and resurrection, and show the way for forgiveness, new life, freedom, deliverance, and oppression. Deliverance from oppression. By the way, blood is an interesting analogy, isn't it? It can be used for life itself. Life is in the blood. But it can also be used for death and destruction. So the blood of the Nile, death and destruction. The blood of the Lamb is an interesting one, who takes away the sins of the world. Think about even modern day imagery of blood. Like, some people's lives are saved because of blood transfusions. How many of you have ever known somebody's life actually saved because of blood donor banks? I know lots of them, right? How many of you have ever donated blood? Why do we do that? To save lives, right? How about anybody aware of blood doping? Blood doping. You know, I've been a cyclist, a competitive cyclist for 30 years. And I used to compete semi-pro. So, like, I competed for money. Even at a semi-pro level, guess what? People cheat. Can you imagine that? Anybody ever heard of Lance Armstrong? All right. Do you know what blood doping is? Like, your red blood cells carry your oxygen. So if you can increase your red blood cells, you can increase your oxygen delivery to your muscles. So when you're under pressure, and have you ever run or worked out in such a way to where you can't hardly breathe anymore? You're hitting your lactate threshold. But if you put more red blood cells in your system, you can take that lactate threshold up about 10 to 15%. And so you can blood dope by all kinds of ways. There's drugs that actually increase your red blood cells. You can actually take your own blood out and then put it in a little and then put your own blood back in, because if you lose blood, your blood will rebuild its red blood cells, and then if you put your own blood back in, it's harder to detect your own blood. And instead of EPO, which is a synthesized drug that increases red blood cells, the whole thing I'm saying is that even in modern sports, there's power in the blood. and so we try to level the playing field, right? So we don't want people cheating. But blood is a fascinating imagery. And as we think about the blood of the Lamb, and the death angel moves past that and spares, and then that blood brings life and transfusion and power and deliverance, but equality to all. And then we see this imagery of Jesus being crushed by the Roman Empire, but then through that death and resurrection being brought to new life. This way of death and resurrection is the way that humanity moves from oppression, despair, sin, and death into new life, new hope, new freedom, new joy, forgiveness. The Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world. Forgiveness, inclusion, nonviolent resistance, communities of love that include everybody, where everybody is equal, and then we live out this love to liberate others and to bring freedom and hope and joy and forgiveness and new life as communities of love. So this is what we're called to do. And I'm going to ask Clifford and Jennifer to come on up and lead us in a song of reflection. This song, I love this song. It's called Exodus. And I think it hits beautifully this theme that we've been talking about.